Welcome to the Lutheran History Podcast, where we cover over 500 years of Lutheran history. We hear news stories, examine old heroes of faith, and we also dig into the who, how, what, and why of writing and making history. So whether you are a Lutheran seeking to understand your faith's rich roots, a history lover, or someone looking for stories of trials, tragedies, and triumphs, you will find what you're looking for right here. Today's guest is Stephen Gurgel, a 2011 graduate from Martin Luther College. He is also a 2012 graduate from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where he got his Master of Arts in History. It's his thesis he completed for that program that we're going to be focusing on today. He is a called worker in the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod. He's been a teacher in the past at St. Paul's Lutheran School in Rapid City, South Dakota from 2013 to earlier this year. And he just recently has started teaching history and religion at West Lutheran High School this past July, beginning with that. So his 2012 thesis is entitled A War to End All Germans, Wisconsin Synod Lutherans and the First World War. This has been published in the Phelps Historical Institute Journal, and we were just chatting before the recording, and he's given a couple presentations on this since then. So, Stephen, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Now, your paper offers a very detailed account and analysis of the social and political forces that, and you use this word in your abstract, that persecuted the German Lutherans of the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod. We'll just call them WELS for now, during World War I. But I think it's interesting, you kind of set the stage by bringing up an earlier battle that took place a generation earlier. Can you tell us a bit about the Bennett Law in Wisconsin and how it impacted the Wisconsin Synod Lutherans?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the Bennett Law is a pretty good example of why some of these things show up or later on in the First World War. So the Bennett Law is an 1890 compulsory education law in the state of Wisconsin. So components of it targeted parochial schools. For one, like there was added regulations to the parochial schools of the Lutheran Church or Catholic Church. And one of the regulations that really struck at the heart of, I guess, WELS Lutherans would be that they tried to eradicate the German language from parochial schools. So that's one that really caught our attention and became a big hot button issue for Wisconsin Synod Lutherans.
Yeah, and I think maybe it needs to just be said up front. I mean, it's pretty obvious. You're still part of that system, right? You're a teacher in the Wisconsin Synod's public high school or private high school system, but you were previously teaching in that parochial school. A lot of churches have some kind of school or preschool program, but I think for a while, weren't we saying that the tiny Wisconsin Synod was the fourth largest private school education system in the entire country? And so it's not just, this is impacting a few people, but this is a huge part of what the Wisconsin Synod has been about for over 150 years. This wasn't just a minor issue. This was kind of attacking the jugular. Yeah,
there's a lot more to this, public school, parochial school thing back then, especially. I mean, the public school initially, or the common school as they called it, was started up by a lot of groups that meant to teach Protestant morality to the next generation. And that's kind of why the parochial school got created in the first place, because a lot of those Protestant morals just didn't always fit with the teachings of the Lutheran Church. So the Catholics were kind of like this too. They just sought to create their own schooling system to teach the teachings of their church. So yeah, it's not necessary. It's a little bit of a different dichotomy today than public and private schools too.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. They're set up to preserve more of the religious sense in contrast to the religion being taught in the public school. And now people almost come for the opposite reason. They're avoiding the secularism, the humanism, the atheism in the public school system, but still that strong desire to keep it separate. Now that Bennett Law and that battle, which was really a political battle that involved more than just Wisconsin Synod Lutherans, you already mentioned some of those societal fault lines uncovered by this struggle. A lot of those maybe more mainline American Protestant, or evangelical, whatever you want to call them, they had a definite societal aim or goal. A lot of them were dry, right? They were anti-alcohol, and they had just had a lot of movements to change society that they were associated with. But why didn't German Lutherans jump on those moral crusade bandwagons like many of the other religious groups?
Yeah, so you kind of laid out, what I would often refer to in my paper, we call them Protestant evangelicals. It was kind of hard to get a label on them, but you're thinking of, the Methodist, Baptist denominations back then. It really comes down to a difference in belief about how a person becomes holy, or how a person becomes righteous in the eyes of God. So a lot of similar beliefs about, that God saves us, but what do you do from there? And a lot of these Protestant evangelical churches, are behind reform movements in the United States, where they really emphasize a personal decision to follow Jesus, and they really emphasize a lot of their efforts into, sanctification, Christian living, and that really spills into reform movements in the United States, because if that's how you make someone holy, then you can make others holy by reforming their behavior too. A very outward view of holiness, I guess, from like a good works perspective. And you contrast that to what I call the liturgical Christians, and Lutherans would fall under that, where the focus is a lot more on the Word of God. It's the Word of God, the gospel, that makes people holy from the inside, and then that spills out into good works and good deeds from there. And that plays out a lot into the politics in these years. I think it was a lot more obvious at this time that we're studying, of the differences. And you mentioned, being dry, Sabbath laws, things like that too.
Yeah. So it's not that the Wisconsin Synod Lutherans didn't want people to be good people, but the fact that they weren't participating in these movements where the rest of society seemed to assume, if you're going to be a good person, you do these kinds of things, you follow these kinds of programs. And a couple of those programs were adopted by Wells and incorporated, maybe like the Sunday school idea, not done exactly the same way as, say, a Methodist or other groups would do it, but it's like, okay, we can see this. There's some benefit to doing a program like this. But I guess the effect is, and this is the sense I got from your thesis, is that it kind of made Wisconsin Synod Lutherans already stick out like a sore thumb, just because they weren't, and Missouri Synod Lutherans too, and others. They just weren't going along with what a lot of other Protestants were doing. So there's that issue that you brought up. And part of it was language, but part of it was for just different people. But then, of course, World War I comes around, and then that not only the language, but also that cultural identity makes Wisconsin Synod Lutherans stand out even more so. Just to kind of give us the context, though, how German was the Wisconsin Synod in the early 1900s? And this is already 50 years after it was founded by immigrants. How would you characterize that?
Yeah, pretty incredible. The data I was able to find in cited publications, about 3% of Wells congregations used English as their primary language in their worship services. So you can see German, especially in the older generation, was just the primary way of speaking. A lot of their churches did have English services, but that was typically like a secondary language being used. I mean, there were some changes being made, but it was definitely happening at a slow pace.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of reflects those immigrant patterns. I mean, you had millions and millions of German immigrants from the 1830s all the way through the early 1900s just arriving. So there's always that fresh blood, I guess, of native-born Germans, just to keep that German language alive. But yeah, just 3% were primarily English speaking. So yeah, that's I would say that's pretty German by any standard. And a question, though, you kind of compared it to some other German immigrant religious groups. Why did some German Lutheran groups like Wells, like the Missouri Synod, maintain their Germanness more than other ethnic German religious groups?
Yeah, as I was looking into it, I kind of noticed some natural reasons, but also just some, religious reasons, I guess. Natural reasons, often like Wells, you would find, and Missouri Synod too, just a little more rural, a little more isolated, where they were able to create their close-knit communities and keep using the language that they were using. Maybe they would be in some cities, but like Milwaukee, which was a German city in many ways as well. At the same time, though, I think a lot of German Lutherans saw the German language as something that kept that Lutheran identity, kept them from maybe mixing in a lot of those Protestant evangelical beliefs about holiness and things like that. There was a fear, like rational or not, that losing the German language would lead them to lose that identity.
I think it was probably here, there, and everywhere. I think if that first generation kind of saw the quote unquote American Lutheran Church and how it had mainly adopted mainline American un-Lutheran positions and doctrines, they probably were rightly concerned about using English language material. But you kind of wonder, was this more of we're preserving the status quo because it makes us comfortable, or is this actually protecting something? You probably could say yes to all those things. Mm-hmm. Right. So World War I happens in 1914. August 1914 is when it really gets started. In America, we didn't join the war until April 1917. So you kind of talk about this neutral period, and it's the timeline. It's actually there's more time for the neutral period than the war period, but a lot of stuff is happening in those first 2.5-ish years of what's going on. So how and why did Wells pursue a church policy of neutrality when many other denominations, I think you had statistic 80% of churches were already preaching a preparation for war?
Yeah, and that's especially true at the end of the neutrality period, especially. None of the Synod publications promoted, Germany's righteous cause in the war, or definitely not England's. In their publications, you actually can find them condemning the belief that God favors either nation as, I quote one of them, the typical heathen idea of a tribal God, this idea that God's going to favor one nation over the other in the affairs of war, that we can discern his will in the affairs of war like that. And I think there was a lot of truth to that.
So, and those two publications, you have the Gemeindeblatt, which is probably the dominant one just because it's the German one, but also Northwestern, which I believe is the precursor to Forward in Christ, which is still around today. And both of them kind of had the same kind of tone, even though they were in different languages. So while officially the Synod was neutral, not picking one side or another, you give some indication as to how deep that neutrality ran. Do you think this neutrality was always sincerely felt or practiced?
Yeah, on the individual level, you'll see that things are a little bit different, and even maybe in some of the organizational level and at the congregational level too. It's natural for many Wells Lutherans. They have family ties with people in Germany or in the German army itself. They're emotionally connected to the German cause of the war. A lot of Americans collected contributions for the Red Cross in England and France, but you have a lot of Wisconsin Synod and Missouri Synod Lutherans collecting for the Red Cross in Germany to try to lessen that hardship. There's a few instances where I found Wells Lutherans were gathering money for their associated churches in Germany, feeling the effects of the war, especially on the Eastern Front where Russia was invading Prussia or Eastern Germany at that time. You could definitely see that their hearts were with Germany in many ways during this neutral period.
Yeah, I think
one thing I forgot to add too is, like the Wells Lutherans are pretty selective in their sources about the war too. There's a lot of evidence in that. To put it lightly, they definitely considered mainstream news coverage of the war to be very partial to the British. So they would often read like these German language publications that definitely were more partial to Germany.
Yeah, not to force a modern phenomenon onto it, but maybe to help understand it. But I think there's kind of that fake news perception out there, right? The mainstream media seems to be favoring one side, so we're going to do our best to research the other side, and almost only believe that version of events too. I think is what I saw. Yeah, and one of the other interesting things you had in your research, I think it was one pastor, he had 15 cousins or relatives in the German army. it's kind of hard to like be totally neutral about it. Like, oh yeah, I don't care who wins when, that's your own flesh and blood being shot at and in harm's way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So despite some official warnings, you had leaders in the synod saying, okay, you got to be careful what you say from the pulpit, your public figures. Many pastors, though, and even other leaders in both church bodies of the Wells and Missouri Synod felt that they could express their views kind of off duty. Well, I'm not in the pulpit. I'm not writing in a public newspaper as a pastor. But some of them were writing President Wilson or state governors and the senators. They felt compelled to speak out against what they perceived as the immoral practice of selling weapons and ammunition for profit, despite national neutrality. They were kind of calling out hypocrisy, and some went even farther than that. Well, how did some of these Lutheran leaders attempt to influence both parties and politicians?
Yeah, you mentioned the writing to politicians. I saw quite a bit of that. Just a couple examples that were a little more prominent than that. So you had this Friedrich Bente guy that was from the Missouri Synod. He was a professor at Concordia Seminary. He actually traveled out to D.C. And testifies before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. All I have of that is actually a summary of what someone said he said. I mean, you could definitely tell he was arguing of George Washington's Proclamation of Neutrality, how we should not get involved in European affairs and get entangling alliances. The evidence you have of what he said is actually a prominent senator writing to Theodore Roosevelt and just complaining about what he's saying. And can you believe this guy that he's arguing against getting involved in the war? And it's pretty interesting, and I think definitely ridiculing how he sounded with his German accent and things like that. The other example that really stood out to me early on was actually a Wells pastor named Otto Engel. He was in Norwalk and Randolph, Wisconsin during these years, took a call kind of halfway through. He really believed, this is actually a quote from what he wrote. He created this organization called the American Liberty League. And this organization, its purpose was to, like you were mentioning, just that belief in fake news, that basically that all the stuff that you're reading out there is pushed through this lens of pro-British vindication of what they're doing in the war. And so, one of his founding documents of that organization says this: it's like believing that the British propaganda is bending every effort to speed the day of an Anglo-American alliance. This Liberty League has been organized with the object of guarding our American rights against pro-ally influences. We must enlighten our American people on what is behind this war, frustrating the scheme of forcing us into an alliance with England. You can definitely see a lot of anger there, just a lot of belief that there is a scheme to bring us into this war in Europe that's happening over there.
Yeah, and that's maybe hard for us to picture that over 100 years later. But, at that time, the United States had only fought wars against England, not two world wars on the same side. So I think there was this big kind of still anti-British, and especially since they were ruling Canada right to the north of most of us, just this idea of we're protecting America. We're true patriotic Americans by protecting us from Britain. And that was kind of the way that they spun it. And just, what was the name of his group? Some kind of like America Liberty League, or?
Yeah, American Liberty League. So they saw themselves as being patriotic. Yeah, that we're exactly like you said, we're protecting American interests against the natural enemy that normally infringes on our interests. So
yeah, so it might be pretty obvious why they weren't going to be anti-German, but it's interesting how, at least what I've seen in your research, the German Lutherans in Wales weren't trying to be pro-German per se, but they were trying to shape their pro-Americanness in a non-anti-German way, kind of using some negatives to define it. But, but that's not how it was really perceived, was it? Right. So how did others in the Synod react to their more outspoken brothers in the faith when they were kind of sticking their necks out there trying to make or influence public policy?
Yep, I actually found it up. We'll talk about the investigation into Otto Engel later, but you actually found in the investigation, there's a prominent Wells lawyer that calls out Otto Engel and kind of says, what you're doing, man, is not a good idea. John Brenner in the Northwestern Lutheran, he admits this. He says, many of our Lutheran brethren have in these last years acted a little unwisely by their love of the land of their birth, or we will admit by their sense of justice. They said, like, while many of these individuals petitioned as an American citizen, they don't petition themselves as a Lutheran pastor. The fact remains that the name of our church was brought into connection with this, and the appearance has been created that the Lutheran Church is now beginning to enter the field of politics. And he was warning against that trend that, hey, it's appearing that we're becoming political, even though it's been the Lutheran belief is the separation of church and state. So he was just kind of warding off some of his brothers in the ministry to be careful.
Yeah, and this is probably a topic that could be its own paper, its own thesis, but just this interesting different views of being non-political, and different people have totally different ideas of the separation of church and state, but this kind of German Lutheran American view of we stay out of politics. And I think a lot of it has to do with keeping in mind being all things to all people, as Paul would say, right? Are you going to burn a bridge with someone over your own personal political opinion, where you really should be focusing on spreading the gospel to them, right? And I think that's
absolutely
the background concern. And in some of the stuff I've looked at, kind of Civil War era, you kind of see that happen too, where they're trying not to really come down hard on one side or another, which in hindsight, it's like, oh, you really should have been anti-slavery, right? Or just, we wish you would have been a little more vocal about that. Maybe same thing today. Some Americans maybe are like, can you believe they weren't condemning the atrocities of the Germans in World War I? But there's a theological depth behind that. So what were some of the other factors that led pre-war government investigators to perceive that Wells was not neutral at all? I found that fascinating that some Wells individuals were investigated even before the war began.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. So one example of that would be like Northwestern College. Quite a bit happened there before the war. And this is just another example of, people getting involved on a personal level. Like a few professors over at Northwestern College were participating in like a German language club, kind of really focused on preserving the German language. This club actually invited someone from India to basically just tell them about the British atrocities that were happening in that land. Obviously, during a time that there's a war, we're considering joining Britain in a war. Obviously, that was with intent to do something like that. Northwestern actually had like a military drill club too, where the students would drill, in military procedures and things like that. That's a pretty normal thing, I think, for a lot of colleges at this time to do that. But one investigator actually paid this a visit and became actually very nervous seeing a bunch of these German Americans drilling during this time. Talked even about confiscating the weapons, was asking the librarian about possibly doing that. And the librarian at Northwestern College is like, hey, isn't there like a Second Amendment that speaks to that? And it made those stories kind of just show how people were a little nervous about how these German Americans might not be so neutral.
Yeah, and that's just a very interesting picture, right? If you went to MLC today, or in Lutheran College, we'd be shocked if we saw 150 guys marching up and down the football field with firearms, right? That would make international news, if that's something we were doing today. But yeah, 100+ years ago, it was kind of like just the thing to do. It was like an extracurricular. Yeah. I have a picture of my great grandpa actually at the Northwestern College, and I think he was like a corporal in that unit or something. So yeah, I was kind of surprised to find that in the family photo album. But yeah, definitely a red flag once you start to put two and two together. Wait a minute, these guys are Germans with guns, and we don't know. We're not so sure about that, right? Yeah. So I think we've covered this question, but let's just make sure we get it clear. So you make a big point in your thesis that basically the position and the rhetoric of Wisconsin Synod Lutherans, and this is more as individuals, could be understood both in a simple way and there's a bit more complex explanation. Can you just rephrase both of those explanations for us?
Yeah, the simple and the obvious one at that time, and even now as we look back, I mean, the quick answer is, well, these German Lutherans acted as they did because they're German. They're German in ethnicity, they're German with their language. That's really almost the too simplistic of the explanation, and it really covers over the other big part of it, which is what I kept seeing, that the Lutheran beliefs are that's the more complicated thing, because it just wasn't as well known among American citizens back then. It's not as well known among American citizens today. This, you think about Lutheran beliefs, the strong separation of church and state, being very skeptical of reform efforts, where you're focusing on only outward behavior to actually make society better. And you're talking about potentially joining a war to end all wars, right? You'd be very skeptical about participating in a war like that, that something good could come out of that. Whereas I think they would look at wars more as like an example of why society is sinful. So yeah, I think that really continues to show itself, especially once we declare war and we really get put in the spotlight. It explains a lot of our behavior and a lot of the reasons why we got in trouble, but it explains a lot of the why we behaved the way we did once the war started.
And so you mentioned briefly just kind of this religious opposition to just that worldview that other Christians in America had. What were some of the religious conclusions that a lot of American Protestants made and then connected with the war? And then can you get into a little deeper why Lutherans like the Wells rejected those ideas?
Yeah, there was a lot of beliefs being thrown out there during this time, and probably just from being emotionally tied to this big event. But a lot of people were convinced, and Christians were convinced, that God was securely on the side of democracy, that's the God-pleasing form of government. It's what America does, so therefore, isn't that a God-pleasing thing? Even like there was one event that really kind of shows this was War Sunday. There was like a federation of churches in America that tried to make this a big nationwide event, where shortly before we declared war, they announced War Sunday. Literary Digest wrote about it, and they reported that in flag-draped pulpits, the pastors of New York and other states sounded the call to arms. So you just have this belief that this war that God is on the side of democracy. It's unchristian to not be democratic, and in Germany, which is not democratic, therefore is the evil side in this war. And I think Wells is going to reject that, just because God doesn't say that democracy is necessarily the best form of government. We can like it, but we don't have to say that God sanctions it.
Yeah, I think you also mentioned some of them had kind of millennial ideas, like, oh, we need to do this so Jesus can come again, right?
It's like you're hastening the return of Jesus by participating in a war to purify Europe or purify America too.
Yeah, and that's a lot of that Wilsonian stuff, like we need to make America safe for democracy. He was a very moralizing president, and in many ways, like, this is just the right thing to do, and it turned a lot of people off, and still does. He's kind of, I think he's ranked lower and lower on presidential favorite lists just because of how, I don't know, self-righteous and arrogant he was in the way he was trying to form both national and international policies. But yeah, that interesting idea of like democracy is equated with good morals and Christianity. You could trace that back to the Revolution. I think one of the slogans there was resistance to tyrants is obedience to God, and that's how they justified rebelling against their God-given authorities. And a book came out a couple of years ago. I'm pretty sure it was after your thesis, but it was called Missionaries of Republicanism, and like Lower Our Republicanism. And this guy looked at the entire religious aspect to the Mexican-American War. Like they're Catholic, and they're also not democratic in a democracy sense. So this is like a holy war. We need to, spread democracy, and therefore it's a just war automatically, no matter how we treat people or if we take land or not. It's justified, right? Because we're spreading democracy. So yeah, America has well over 150 years of this kind of mindset at this point. And Wells Lutherans are smacking really hard right up into it because of their worldview. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for sharing that. Now, this is something else I found fascinating too. It's your research revealed that in some German populated areas of the country, such as the two counties I spent most of my life in, Sheboygan and Manitowoc County. Over 99% of the population voted against entering World War I in referendums. They weren't votes that actually counted for anything, but it's just an overwhelming, like everyone here is against entering this war. So that would make some people nervous, I would think. How did the government respond to such decidedly anti-war segments of the population once war was declared in April of 1917?
Yeah, I think at the very least, people saw these anti-war populations that existed, or pockets that were very anti-war. They saw it as a threat to the success of the American cause in the war. World War I is just a really good example of a total war where, on the home front, every behavior of the citizens could affect the outcome. So at the very least, people are fearful in that way. And then you have a lot of citizens, many, probably too many, that fear that these communities could provide safe havens for like the German spies and could sabotage the American war effort purposefully. So some publications were even estimating at this time that over 200,000 agents for Germany were secretly undermining the war effort. So you can imagine such a large number that we got to do something about that, because this is going to make us lose the war if we have such a people against it, such a large number of people against it.
Yeah, and you had an interesting image from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and it was just a bunch of normal-looking people, but the title was something like, "Could you identify the German spy, amongst your neighbors," or something like that, and just kind of this spy hysteria. So a lot of sleuthing and kind of the Hardy Boy kind of stuff was encouraged, is I guess how I put it. And one of the major organizations that was encouraging this anti-spy activity or anti-treason activity was the APL. Can you tell us what the APL was, and how would you characterize that volunteer forces work?
Yeah, so APL stands for American Protective League. So this is like a citizen vigilante group organized by the Department of Justice, the Bureau of Investigation, which later becomes the FBI. There were over 250,000 citizens that had officially signed up to participate in this program. So these citizens took it upon themselves to discover those spies and saboteurs that you were hearing about in your newspapers and things like that. And they were really located highly in places with high German ethnicity. So there are about 280 headquarters of the American Protective League nationwide. About half of them were located just in the upper Midwest, like Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas. So clearly, they're targeting a certain area, and where a lot of Wells and Missouri Synod Lutherans are. So we're definitely part of the focal point of that investigation. I mean, these people kind of saw themselves as like the official agents for America. They actually could buy a badge for 75 cents. And it looked really real. It had it was metal. It had eagle on the top. It just looks like you're almost like part of the Secret Service. There were some really valuable reading works written by APL authors, like shortly after, kind of bragging about what they've done, and they're bragging about breaking into citizens' homes and breaking into meetings and to inform on what's happening. And just really, they saw themselves as, big part of this crusade to save America from these spies.
Yeah, and just to be clear, they weren't authorized to, and they didn't have warrants, right? They were just literally breaking and entering and stealing stuff. So a lot of unconstitutional stuff resulted from this.
Yeah, you reminded me of a quote that one of the APL historians said shortly after. He says, "It is supposed that breaking and entering a man's home or office place without warrant is burglary. Granted, but the League has done that thousands of times and has never been detected." So just a kind of a brag about how we broke people's civil liberties, but it was all for a good cause.
We were very good at it, so it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of scary stuff. And, especially a century later, I think, as people become more skeptical of their government, this is maybe where it kind of started, right, with this kind of stuff happening. Yeah, they did have to be told, you mentioned, that they can't just whip out their 75-cent badge and stop trains and tell people I'm with the Secret Service, because apparently that was happening, where people were basically guilty of impersonating a government officer, which they were not. They were just kind of volunteers. Basically, the idea was, right, they're just supposed to, if you see something, say something, right? If you see something suspicious, report it. But they were...
Yeah, they shouldn't take action themselves, but they're mostly just to justice.
Yeah. So there's another group too, called the CPI. Could you talk about that and its work briefly as well?
Yeah, so that's one more meant to control, information that's going out there. So CPI stands for the Committee on Public Information. So that's to control the information being shared about the war. Really just trying to bring some campaigns in to, bring up enthusiasm about fighting the war. One really good example of something they fostered was the 4-Minute Men. There were about 75,000 people that were the 4-Minute Men. They were speakers. They gave about 750,000 speeches around the nation during this time to just kind of bring up enthusiasm about the war, or get people to believe in the righteous cause of the war. They'd give these on street corners where people were walking by, or during an intermission of a movie, or we found out after church services, sometimes they would go into, if the pastor would let them, they would go in and give their 4-minute speech that they would give over and over again. So just really this idea that this total war idea again, where we got to get everybody on board, and the Committee on Public Information, that was their job to do that.
So those are official organizations, even if people stepped outside the bounds of what they were designed to do. Well, how did some, I guess, quote unquote, patriotic anti-German forces outside of any government sanction treat their Lutheran neighbors? You have several anecdotes and reports of that.
Yeah, so a lot of times people would under force, drag somebody out of their home, make them kiss an American flag, for example, just like this kind of mob culture. A very popular thing to do at this time was to take yellow paint, yellow being the color of disloyalty, and just dump it or spray it onto a home or a church. And this happened to a couple of Lutheran churches to do that, just to show that this place is disloyal. There were other examples, maybe not with German Lutherans, but other people that were. There was even a German immigrant that got lynched during that time, and the sad news was that this guy actually volunteered to be in the army. That this guy clearly wasn't anti-American in that way. But yeah, so some sad situations happening nationwide there.
So with that in mind, with this extra pressure, in what way were the Wells Lutherans still combative, and that's the word you use, in their anti-war stance following the declaration of war?
Yeah, I think early on, there's definitely a shift that happens once Wells Lutherans realize that this kind of talk won't be tolerated. But in the very early days when war is declared and they're giving their commentary on it, they're still arguing or blaming speculators or other forces for dragging us into this war. It's not a good thing. You even have you could even say big names in the Wisconsin Synod, like, seminary professors, J.P. Kaler, August Pieper, John Schaller, evidence of them attending mass meetings or, to maybe encourage America to change its mind about the war. So that would be maybe more of the combativeness. On the individual level, you'll see this a little more too, like Otto Engel, that one I was mentioning earlier, the American Liberty League. He's very adamantly outspoken with that Liberty League, sending out mailers out to all these different people to, in the Wisconsin region and beyond, especially arguing against what the government is doing in these early stages of the war, of trying to bring all people and trying to suppress all opinion against the war. Very outspoken about the liberties of Americans and what are they doing and things like that.
So can you tell us about the story? It's kind of at least to some people, if you've ever been to New Ulm, kind of a famous story of what happened there in the summer of 1917 and the aftermath of that event.
Yeah, so New Ulm is quite a story. How much time you got? There's a lot going on there. So New Ulm, being a very in Minnesota, where Martin Luther College is, it's the College of Ministry, or Dr. Martin Luther College at that time, the College of Ministry for teachers in the Wisconsin Lutheran Synod. And the town itself is very ethnically German. So not only do you have German Lutherans there, but you have German Catholics, German, other types of Germans there as well. So the whole town, in essence, is not on board with a lot of the things that are happening. And one of the big issues that comes up early on in the war is the draft. So you can imagine just a few things here, just to put some perspective on this. This is really the first draft in United States history where people are drafted to fight in an army, not to fight on the homeland of America, but to be sent somewhere else to go fight for America. So that's kind of a new thing for a lot of people. And then in addition to that, you could just imagine being asked to go, or not asked, being told to go to Europe and go fight against or fire at these Germans that many of them you might be related to. So there was a lot of concern from the young men in New Ulm and other places too about what's going to happen if I'm told I get drafted. And a lot of these men were drafted. So some of those concerns were brought to people in New Ulm, and New Ulm, people decided, let's do something about this. Let's start a movement maybe to only rely on non-draftees to fight in this war. So New Ulm organizes a big parade with speeches. You're talking about 10,000 people attending this parade, and that's about twice the population of New Ulm at that time, perhaps even more. So I mean, you're looking at a large mass parade marching down Main Street, going over to German Park, and at the end of this parade, which includes these drafted soldiers that we're kind of advocating for, then you have speeches given by several prominent people of New Ulm. And among the prominent people of New Ulm, you have one really prominent Wells lay member, Retzlaff. I think there's still a Retzlaff hardware in New Ulm today. And you have professors from Dr. Martin Luther College, including the president of Dr. Martin Luther College, that speaks about, some of the things that are upsetting them about the draft and just about fighting in the war in general. And it's they're speaking to a crowd that is basically loving every single word they're saying. There's stamping of feet. There's a lot of cheering and shouting. And they really believed that they could cause a movement to move across the United States that might make the Americans reconsider this draft, and that would save these young men from having to go fight in the war. There's a petition being passed around where all the citizens are signing it, suggesting that only citizens that want to go fight in the war in Europe have to go fight in that war. So and there's quite a bit happens after that, but that's really the combativeness, I guess, of that with New Ulm.
Yeah. So let's put a pin in that, and let's come back to the, if we're going to do one example at least, let's see what happens after that protest. I mean, it was more than a protest. I mean, it was the entire county, it seems, turned out and forced to just reject national policy. So despite the hatred and sometimes violent reactions toward German American Lutherans, sometimes that hostility was, I would say, more hilarious hysteria. And you give a lot of good examples. For example, people actually reported to the government that Lutheran churches in America were funded personally by the Kaiser, or that part of the Lutheran pastor's ordination was included an oath of loyalty to the Kaiser. And this is the one I found most hilarious, was that money was sent directly to Lutheran churches through a quote-unquote pneumatic tube underneath the Atlantic Ocean. Like the Kaiser's just kind of like a giant bank tube, right? You're putting his gold marks in there, and they're popping out. I don't know, in a Lutheran church basement somewhere. But, despite all those kind of silly stuff, a lot of the reports against the German American Lutherans are taken quite seriously. So could you just tell to me what would happen if someone reported on me, and I was there 100 plus years ago, if I were around in 1917, 1918, what would happen to me if I were about to receive a special guest from the government?
Yep. And this special guest that could be visiting your church, you would never know that they were appointed by the government to visit your church. So a lot of these people could be from the American Protective League, that citizen vigilante group, or just another agent for the Department of Justice. But one of their favorite things to do, because they definitely had the Lutheran Church in their crosshairs, was to send these people into church services. Those who could speak German especially were selected, pretending to be a visitor. I'm just here to learn about your church. I want to attend a church service. And they were looking for anything that could possibly be used against the pastor or other people attending the church service. We felt that this would be a really good environment to catch them because they feel like they're among like-minded people. So of course they're going to say something treasonous here or something like that. So there's records and records and records of these reports that of people attending church services, and probably a lot that never still don't exist but happened. Probably hundreds of thousands or thousands of times this happened where churches were visited.
So you give several cases of where WELS pastors were investigated, and maybe we'll ask you to tell the rest of the New Ulm story in just a minute. But just, I guess, to be direct, were any WELS pastors or individuals revealed to actually be spies or traitors? You give a lot of case studies.
Yeah, and the short answer, I guess, is no. Like the way we consider the term spies and traitors, definitely not spies. I guess the word traitor might be in the eye of the beholder. So when you put yourself in the mind of one of these people, being a traitor might be saying that they're not a big fan of the draft, or being a traitor might be that I'm not a big fan of supporting the government with the Liberty Loan, and saying things like that. So in that regard, they said, yes, there are a lot of these traitors here, and a lot of people actually ended up getting arrested. There's this law called the Sedition Act of 1918, and that one had a lot of teeth to it. It basically made it illegal to hinder the war effort in any way. So if you are speaking out against these things that are helping the war effort, therefore you're breaking the Sedition Act. And that's when WELS Lutherans really realized they had to be careful in their speech. And some were, and some remained not so careful, I guess. And some of those people did get arrested. I mean, just off the top of my list here, I have this guy, pastor named Hendrickson from Nebraska, a pastor named Thorough from Wisconsin Rapids, this guy named Atrops in White Lake, South Dakota, Auerswald in Marinette, Wisconsin. A couple that I wanted to talk a little more about were Ed Ginther. He's actually kind of a big name because he was one of those first people to reach out to the Apache in Arizona, so like a missionary to the Apache, and he was followed by a lot of WELS Lutherans because this is a fantastic thing to be bringing. Fort Apache, which is a military base, helping out some soldiers that were training out there, and apparently "To the Colors" was played, or a patriotic song, and they say refused. He, good chance, just forgot to stand attention during that time, and for that he was arrested, and they kind of released him, basically saying, we'll release you, we're not going to be investigating you anymore. And right in the investigative document it says we told him that so that he would not be under suspicion that we're going to be keeping following him. And he had a lot of people followed him, even going to his house. So one agent writes, this is an APL person, so some of the things they do is kind of crazy, but one APL agent writing about how he's laying outside of Ginther's house with his ear on the ground, listening to, the conversation happening in the Ginther's house. And he reports that he heard Ginther say, "The captain's keeping me posted," or something like that. So he must be in touch with a German captain and is trying to undermine the American cause in the war. So that was quite one. This other guy named John Gauss, he was a very outspoken guy. And I guess if you don't want to be somebody, you don't want to be an outspoken guy during this time. Very strong in his opinions, and very strong in his opinions about the war. He was a pastor in Gennaro, Ohio, a very small town that was basically all Wisconsin Synod Lutherans. So you feel like you're in a safe space. And he kind of learns pretty quickly that basically a whole bunch of agents kind of head down there, and he ends up getting arrested. Nothing really specifically, but just like from the Sedition Act, where he's saying some things maybe about the Liberty Loan or things like that they don't really like, and his trial becomes a big ordeal. A lot of agents attended, hoping that this guy gets put away, and he ends up getting not guilty, which was kind of a surprise. But he was one of those people actually that after the not guilty verdict, a trophy train of soldiers about a year after the war visit his house because they heard about this guy. and they forced John Gauss to go out and buy a Liberty loan in front of everybody to help pay for the war. This was actually when his wife and children were sick with the Spanish flu, and he was kind of saying like, please just go away. And he bought some war bonds and got them to leave. And you can kind of get the feeling for what's going on with that. So
yeah, definitely a strong current of, we expect everyone to conform and toe the line, and we're going to make you pay if you don't. For Americans, it's kind of a touchy topic today too, of how much do you have that personal liberty versus being part of the team effort, I guess. Yeah, a lot of stuff to think about for today as well. But let's get back to that New Ulm case. So what happened? They had thousands of people show up in New Ulm being against the draft, and I'm guessing the government just didn't say, oh, that's okay.
Yeah, among those thousands of people that were at that New Ulm meeting were government agents. They saw posters about this, and this obviously caught their attention. And so they were reporting on it. It's very heavily reported on what was said and what was getting passed around. And because of the success of the rally, at least to the people that ran it, including the president of DMLC, they've decided that let's take this out to the surrounding area. So they actually start visiting small towns surrounding the area, hoping that this just kind of spreads like wildfire. And DML President Ackerman is speaking at a lot of those. And in some areas, you actually have patriotic citizens shutting those visits down, or the government trying to shut those things down from happening. And that happens in a few cases. But in other places, they are able to speak or go out of town and speak, things like that. It's but then it becomes pretty obvious to people like Ackerman, the DMLC president, and other people that they're potentially getting in some big trouble for this. They're getting followed just on the street when they go to the store. It's clearly that they're being tailed by a government agent, and that's when and I don't think the enthusiasm catches on nationwide. I think they start realizing that this is more of something that we feel locally, but nationwide, this is not how Americans are feeling. And so basically, this is going to end up costing Ackerman his job. He's followed for quite some time. They actually attend quite a few church services where he preaches, and they sadly say that nothing. We're not seeing him saying anything that's bad. He's just talking about religious stuff. Excuse me while I cough. Sorry.
Isn't it?
But really, the Minnesota Commission of Public Safety, which is a whole other institution in the state of Minnesota, they don't want to take this lying down either. So they actually go to Dr. Martin Luther College, their board, and say that you have some unpatriotic staff members on your staff. We will not permit an institution to remain open if you have unpatriotic staff members on your staff. Really puts DMLC in a tough position. They potentially might have to shut down if they don't do something about Ackerman and maybe some of the other people that spoke. So Ackerman kind of gets ahead of it. He resigns. He's not that he's like repentant about it or anything like that, but he resigns just to kind of save DMLC from having to make that tough decision. And that really is the biggest thing that affects them. And there's other consequences for other New Ulmites, like the New Ulm mayor gets arrested. The city attorney has a bunch of legal issues. There's a captain in like the local militia. That's so Ackerman's not the only person getting targeted, but as one of those leaders of this movement, he loses his job over it.
That's maybe one of the larger extreme examples of combativeness and its consequences. Yet at the same time, you also pointed out that there are many Wells Lutherans who supported the war in various ways. Do you want to talk about some of the ways that the Wells Lutherans got behind the war effort?
Yeah, early on, there was even movements to support the war effort, but it was kind of on their terms. Like, let me just give you a couple options. One option was to support the Red Cross. The Red Cross was well supported by Wells Lutherans early on because that one wasn't really, causing Germans to die or causing maybe relatives to die. It's a humanitarian effort to help American soldiers that are wounded to help them recover and things like that. So that was a very popular thing to support. What wasn't as popular to support was the Liberty Loan. And there were some reasons for this. The Liberty Loan was basically to help the U.S. Prosecute the war. The government, through that Committee on Public Information, basically told churches that they need to support this Liberty Loan. There was this one declaration by the Committee of Public Information of Liberty Loan Sunday, and they asked that in churches nationwide that the gospel of the Liberty Bond be preached from the pulpits during the sermons and things like that. And you can imagine how that would go normally, but then you add the element of the war to it as well. And a lot of Lutheran pastors write back to the CPI or other government officials on how could you tell us what to say in church? I'm going to talk about the gospel of Jesus, not the gospel of the Liberty Bond. Herbert Hoover, who is the director of the Food Administration during this time, also asks for a food conservation Sunday, where the topic of your sermon or the topic of your church service should be how saving food and conserving food is helpful for the war effort and therefore a God-pleasing thing. So a lot of those things you can imagine just causes probably a backlash among WELS Lutherans, and they're not interested in supporting these things at all. What's kind of interesting, though, is if you look at the data about how much Lutherans or Germans in the Wisconsin region and other regions are supporting these Liberty Loans, there's 3 Liberty Loans that happen about a year apart. The first one hardly supported at all by Lutherans or Germans. The second one a little more, and then the third one was actually the one where WELS Lutherans contribute quite a bit to it, because I think they kind of discovered that by participating in this Liberty Loan, by giving to the Liberty Loan, you kind of get these government officials off your back. It's kind of a proof that, hey, I'm loyal. I'm not a German spy. Yeah, exactly. So the third Liberty Loan was actually quite supported later on. But there were also genuine, acts of supporting the American side as well. I think you find that especially in like the ladies' associations of congregations on the congregational level. You see a lot of things like sending aid to American soldiers, or like campaigns to help out the Red Cross and things like that. So you find that a lot at the congregational level, especially.
All right. So as we're wrapping up the content of your research here, in your thesis, you've amply demonstrated that WELS Lutherans faced some severe, systematic, and persistent persecution of many different forms. Yet rather than fall apart or cave in or divide, disintegrate, instead the WELS emerged more or less intact and perhaps stronger in some ways. Well, why did the WELS persevere through this kind of challenge?
I think WELS Lutherans were already, made plenty aware how they were very unique in their culture and beliefs, and this Protestant evangelical, whatever you want to call it, empire of America. So I think just having that, knowing that they had that distinct identity and seeing that play out, and to them probably viewing it very much as being persecuted for being different, and also being persecuted for sticking to the truths of God's word in many cases, really was almost rejuvenating to them to hold their ground, even though it meant sometimes being investigated a little more or being potentially arrested. It did, I think, really cement some of those identities in the Wisconsin Synod Lutheran people's minds about how they are a little different, or there are some big differences in what we believe compared to many other Americans when it comes to faith and how we are made righteous and things like that.
Yeah, kind of they had to decide, right? Is this the thing I'm going to hold on to, or is this something that I'm going to give up? And it caused, I don't know, maybe a firmer association with their own religious identity on top of the cultural stuff too. So finally, this wasn't really the purpose of your thesis, but I'm guessing you may have some insight into it. How do you think the WELS' World War I experiences changed the Synod or shape its future anyway?
Well, I think the most immediate thing is it accelerates the abandonment of the German language. I mean, it was something that was going to happen over time, but it definitely, you can see even in the publications that this is something we can pursue. This is not the end of the world. And I think it made a lot of people consider that we need to do this a little more quickly. I don't know. At the same time, though, it gave Wells Lutherans a strong reminder about why reforming from the outside, it's this idea of becoming righteous from the outside first, or having the emphasis on that, is a bad idea. It really allowed us to keep the Word of God as the focus, because that's really what makes us, holy in God's eyes, is that the Word of God, it's the gospel. So in that way, I guess there wasn't a lot of change. It almost reaffirmed in what they believed.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing the contents of your research and your thoughts. I encourage anyone listening to this, you could find this either through the Wells Historical Institute journal. I believe those copies are now available on their website for free for download, or you can find the entire thesis. I think I just Googled it and I found it. It's pretty available, but I'll also
pretty easily accessible.
To make it even easier for our listeners, I'll put a link in the episode description, so you have no excuse for not reading this, basically, if you want to. Now into the second section, a shorter part, but we're also interested in the history process. How did you get started on this topic and project?
Yeah, so this is while I was at grad school that I kind of stumbled upon this topic. Just in my vast readings for courses I was taking, I was reading a book about the home front of World War I in the United States. And I just, everything else that I read about, I kind of maybe read other books on the topic. And everything I read, it always mentioned about how, Lutherans were mentioned quite often, and saying they were against the war, or they were even maybe pro-Germany. And the explanation was always so simple. Like they always gave the simple explanation. And growing up as a Wells Lutheran and kind of understanding, some of the beliefs we have about separation of church and state, and the idea of, or the biblical truth about how God, can transform us through the gospel. That really made me kind of go, I bet you there's more to this story. And the more I was digging into it, the more I liked what I saw. So that kind of became my topic for my end of my master's degree thesis.
Yeah, and what was your research method like then, as you pursued answering that question, trying to get to that deeper answer?
Yeah, so I started with a lot of the Synod publications. That's kind of what I had at first, and it was probably what I had for the first few months. And then the big breakthrough came was when I discovered all the Bureau of Investigation files, which had these reports from the American Protective League. It was available online with some subscription service that I had, and just thousands upon thousands of pages of microfilm that I was able to kind of sift through. And one of the big breakthroughs, because it'd be almost impossible to read all that, but they did have some keyword searches that sometimes worked, and I was able to. Yeah, so as far as the research method was, I went to the seminary and found a roster of the Wells pastors in 1917, and was just plugging last names and first names into it, and the towns where they were at, and seeing whatever I could find. And I bet you I found maybe a good percentage of it, but I bet you there was a lot that wasn't discovered as well, because sometimes the research or finding those documents, the proper documents, was a little bit difficult.
Okay, so you're saying you didn't list necessarily every single pastor who was ever investigated or has a file on him.
Yeah, and some of
a lot, but yeah.
So some of the difficulties too was, I'd often try to think about, okay, how could an American citizen misspell this German sounding name? Yeah. So I'd often try, and usually sometimes it would happen on my second or third variation, I would find the actual pastor. And sometimes like the document just wasn't scanned well enough where a keyword search wouldn't work. So I tried to, look through as many documents as I could, but I'm sure there's a lot out there that I haven't found. So if anybody wants to do a little more digging, there's a good chance you'll find something.
All right. Well, you already mentioned some of the challenges, just being people not knowing how to spell German names correctly on forms and some of those other things. Do you have anything else that kind of helped or hindered your research effort?
Yeah, that was the big one. I think the other challenge, and this is where, there's a lot more to be done out there, is just there's so many great things at the local congregational level that can add to this story. And I was only able to get to so many. I sent out some requests, and a lot of those requests were heard. I probably visited 10 to 15 congregations and was able to go through their materials on it. But there's probably so many more out there that are tucked away in a church basement somewhere that has some great material out there. And it's written in probably a German manuscript that's very hard to read. And I was able to use people like Professor Calpine, the elder one at Martin Luther College, to help me translate some of those ones that were way beyond what I was able to do. So there probably is a lot more out there to discover, and that's kind of the exciting thing, but it's also the frustrating thing too, because you wonder what else is out there.
Yeah. So you mentioned a lot of the excitement. I would guess those government files, which were probably pretty thorough, would cause some excitement for you. Anything else just kind of help you have a big breakthrough or anything?
Yeah, I would say when I first discovered that microfilm with all the files, I was waking up at probably 5 a.m. every day, running over to do more research. It was definitely an exciting time. Yeah, as far as like unanswered questions or things else to explore, yeah, I think basically I'm more interested. It's very easy to see what's happening at the top level of the synod and things like that, but I would be a lot more interested in seeing what happened on the local level, because I think every congregation probably had a different story based on where they were in the country and what the local conditions were like. So yeah, very interesting, and there's a lot of stories out there that probably just will hopefully we'll be able to find eventually.
Yeah. Any other angle someone could maybe take on this topic? You said maybe more of the local stuff, but maybe another question that could be answered. Anything like that?
Nothing off the top of my head. I mean, a lot of these ones that I bring up, like I mentioned Otto Engel, and I didn't even really have to read the thesis maybe about what happens with his investigation, because it's quite fascinating, all the raids of his home and things like that. There's probably a lot more to be found on just these individual stories. I mean, the New Ulm thing is probably a good 20 to 30 pages in my 200-page thesis. It could be a 200-page thing on its own, because there's so much left unsaid about even just the other people that were leading the charge, and what happened afterwards. And so I think just taking some of those smaller pieces, and you could really expand on them with some more research.
Yeah. So now it's almost it's about 10 years after you really wrapped up your thesis here. Do you have any upcoming history projects? Anything you're working on?
Nothing at the moment, and that's the thing where I was a grade school principal and 7th and 8th grade teacher for the last 8 years, and this is kind of my style. Is when I get into something, I kind of pour my heart into that and kind of leave everything else off. So this project has collected dust, I guess, the last 8 years or so. But now that I'm back teaching history, there's some potential opportunities to dig into these things again, especially if I decide to go back to school in this area. I'm very fascinated, as you can tell, by the intersection of American, cultural movements or political movements with how does that affect, and how are we affected by it? How do we influence that in the Lutheran Church? Because as we notice, there's a lot of things that are unique about the Lutheran Church, and it sometimes causes the Lutheran Church to stand out. And it's kind of neat to see how our faith can be shown even in times when we stand out. So a few other times, I guess, another thing around this time that'd be really interesting for someone to study would be the Prohibition movement. Just because that is a reform movement that's very based on outward behavior. And you can imagine, as German Lutherans, there probably would be an angle to look at it. That
kind of like that. Let's kick you while you're down, right? We're already on top of you for the World War I thing, and now we're going to take your beer away, right? Yeah. New Ulm was not happy in the early 1900s. Yeah. All right. So you kind of alluded to it. You just kind of like that Lutherans in society, culture, politics. But anything in general, what would you like to see more research and writing done on within Lutheran history?
I imagine I'd be interested. We talked about it kind of briefly at the beginning on how just American society has changed so much. We talked about the origins of the public school was to teach these Protestant morality to the next generation. But now, obviously, like secular humanism is kind of behind a lot of the things that are happening in the public school. And you think about recent things that have happened in American society with the 1980s. You have this whole moral majority thing. I'd be very curious about how the Lutheran Church has interacted during those years, 60s, 70s, 80s, as there is a seat, kind of like a movements to reform America again. But this time you have the Lutheran Church, which is English speaking, a little more integrated into American culture. In what ways can we support some of those things? I'm just thinking like focus on the family or some organizations like that. What are some ways that we can focus on those things, but without also losing about what's important about what we believe in faith alone, grace alone, scripture alone too. So I'd find that to be a very interesting area of study. Maybe not now, but later.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Steve Gurgel, for joining us today. We really enjoyed your research and the fact that you were willing to take time to share that with us.
Thanks so much for having me. It was fun to share.